A man was driving from 29 Palms, California to Albuquerque, New Mexico. 29 Palms is located in the desert east of LA, and the route that he took for this was actually just a shortcut. It was a little 2-lane road through total nothingness except for the town of Amboy. On top of that, the town of Amboy itself is nearly abandoned. With a population of just 4 people, it's actually as far below sea level as Death Valley. It's also got a dormant volcano and lava field on one side and a salt flat on the other. In addition to this, it's got scorching temperatures. Oh yeah, and it's been a hotspot for satanic group activity at various points in time. Apparently, before he left, some friends had dared him to take that shortcut to the I-40 because of how deserted it was. So the man is just driving along in the afternoon. He stops in Amboy to take a picture of the city sign to prove to his friends that he was there. And then after grabbing the picture, he gets back into his car and proceeds to drive up into the mountain range between Amboy and the I-40. Once he reached the top, the road went north through a canyon with high grass on both sides of the road, and up ahead of him, he could see some stuff in the middle of the road. And as he gets closer, he slows down, and he can make out now that it is a red Pontiac Fiero stopped sideways across both lanes. There's also a suitcase open with clothes scattered everywhere, and 2 bodies laying face down in the road, one of a man and one of a woman. He stops his car about 100 feet away, and the hair on the back of his neck is just standing up, and he's thinking something's wrong here. In fact, so wrong that he reaches under his seat and pulls out his pistol and places it on the seat next to him. And as he's entering forward, he realizes why he's so freaked out, and that's because it was too perfect. It looked staged. So he's thinking, is this an ambush, or am I being paranoid? I'm definitely not getting out of my car. This is freaky. So he sits there for a minute just looking at the bodies and the road, and he sees that there's enough room on one side to the man that he could probably drive around in that shape around the bodies and then around the Pontiac. So without a moment's hesitation, he guns it and swerves around the man, around the woman, past the Pontiac, and he doesn't stop for another couple hundred feet. Finally, he slows down so he can breathe, let his heart slow down a little bit because his adrenaline is pumping, and then he looks back into his rearview mirror, and what he saw was terrifying. The man and woman were now on their knees looking up at him, and 20 or so other people were coming out of the tall grass on either side of the road. So he slams the gas pedal back down and doesn't let up until he finally reaches the I-40 East on-ramp. And he's thinking to himself, what were those people doing out there? That was the middle of nowhere. There's literally nothing around there. And why were there so many of them? On top of that, that was very clearly a setup. They staged that. And what were they going to do to me? Like, what would they have done had I stopped? Even though he doesn't know what would have happened to him had he gotten out of the car, it's fair to say that it almost certainly would not have been good. One night, a woman named Stephanie was making her nightly hour-and-a-half commute. An hour-and-a-half commute, that's a long commute no matter what, but to make hers worse, it's also at night, and Stephanie's got a bad habit of falling asleep in cars. So, her sister Jen made her promise to call her on her drive so that they could talk and so that Stephanie wouldn't fall asleep. So Jen and Stephanie are just talking one night on the phone. All of a sudden, Stephanie starts screaming, and because of how frantic Stephanie was, Jen could barely understand what she was saying. But eventually, Stephanie managed to communicate that there is a girl covered in blood crawling out of the ditch onto the road. Stephanie circles back around and jumps out of her car and runs to the girl. And as she jumps out, her phone falls onto the ground. But thankfully, they were still close enough so that Jen could hear what was going on. And Jen could hear the girl sobbing and telling Stephanie that she needed help and that they were coming back for her and asking why it was Stephanie, why it had to be her. And at this point, Stephanie's thinking this girl might be having a mental breakdown because of how frantic and disconnected her thoughts were, and because she needed help, but for some reason she didn't think Stephanie could help her. In hindsight, however, it's more likely that the girl didn't think that Stephanie, at 5'8", 100 pounds, would be able to protect her from whatever or whoever was chasing her. Just then, Stephanie sees a truck pulling up close to them and was about to wave them down, but the girl started going crazy and clawing and pleading with her to run because whoever was in that truck was the one who had been chasing her. So the truck gets closer, puts on its high beams, and then 2 very large men jump out and start walking towards them, all the while catcalling and whistling at them. And Stephanie's blood turns to ice as she sees them, and she's full of adrenaline now. She grabs the girl and starts forcing her into the car. Then she runs around her side of the car and just manages to jump in and start to accelerate as the men got close enough to smash the lights on her car. So she speeds away from them, just clipping one of the guys, but they jump back in the truck quickly and caught up to Stephanie. And for the next half an hour, the truck was trying to run them off the road, and they only finally stopped chasing them as Stephanie pulled into a hospital. Inside the hospital, the girl was still panicked and wouldn't let Stephanie out of her sight. She just kept repeating Stephanie's name over and over and telling the doctors that she was her best friend. And Stephanie learned from the doctors that the girl had been repeatedly raped and then tied to the back of the truck and dragged behind it as it was moving. To add to the creepiness of the whole event, After finally leaving the girl in the hospital, Stephanie went home and was getting changed and noticed that she had grabbed the wrong name tag. The name tag that she had was one of her co-workers, and yet despite not remembering ever telling the girl her name, the girl had been calling her by her real name and not the name that was on her name tag. To this day, Stephanie has no idea how this girl learned her name. A man was out doing some exploring on some country roads in a remote rural area as he normally would on weekends. He's been out all day, just kind of driving around, exploring, seeing anything that looks interesting. He's got his windows down, he's got his iPod plugged in, and it's also plugged into one of these FM transmitters that transmits to a radio station, and then you set the station on your car radio to match that. It's also fast approaching dusk because he's been out enjoying himself all day at this point. The roads in that area are typically these sharp 90-degree turns around farmers' fields. He eventually comes up to another intersection, except this one's not a 90-degree turn. It's a three-way. The turn to the right was another paved road like the one he was on, but the path straight was this sort of gravel, really overgrown single-lane road. And he thinks to himself, wow, I'm exploring, I've got my lifted pickup truck, let's keep on going. And after a small stretch with some really tall corn on either side, he comes up to some woods. And although it was reaching dusk, and you could see the orange sky in the mirrors from the sunset, he thinks to himself, I want to keep exploring for a little bit longer. So the woods in that area are getting pretty thick, and because, the sun's going down, it's getting even darker in the forest. But that really didn't bother him, so he kept going, and the road continued to get worse as he continued along, turning into more of a trail than a road. In fact, it didn't even have real bridges over the small streams. The gravel just got larger. But again, because he was in his 4x4, he just drove right over, and then something weird happened. Over one of those, he hits a pretty big bump, and his radio is suddenly super clear and says,
"Do you want to die, Virgin?"
The man tries to laugh it off, but he's also thinking, yeah, that was pretty weird. But the radio goes back to static, and up ahead to his left, a meadow opens up through the trees, so he stops worrying and tears down a small decline in the meadow in four-wheel drive. After tearing it up for a bit in the meadow, he keeps heading down the rough road. All the while, the radio is coming in and out with unintelligible talking. But at this point, he's reasoned to himself that it's just one of those audiobook channels that keeps coming in and out. Eventually, he comes to a dead end in the road at the edge of a ravine, and it looks like there used to be a bridge there, but now it's just water and air, and the bridge has clearly been out for a while. The road is also fairly narrow, so you can't make a three-point turn, so he's kind of sitting there deciding what to do when he notices 5 people. 2 are across the ravine on the other side where the road starts again. 1 is on the bank opposite him, and then 2 downstream on the bank he's on, and they're all kind of staring at him. He thinks that maybe he interrupted their fishing time or something, so he decides to just back out until he finds a spot wide enough on the road to turn around. Once he's headed the opposite direction again, he starts to tear it up in the meadow for a bit, and he notices a spot in the tree line where he could go down to some very wet dirt. He starts to go that direction, but then the radio comes in clear again.
"Have you made your decision yet?"
So he's officially creeped out, and he tries to keep it cool, but he's definitely heading for the exit now. The radio is now silent, not static like before when no signal was coming in though. And in order to get back out of there, he has to go back up the incline of the meadow, which was a bit difficult because of the slippery mud. And then all of a sudden, the radio comes back on one more time, and he hears,
"Time's up. We're coming."
So the man is now in full freak-out mode. His adrenaline's going, he jams the power button on the radio, switches the pickup truck into 4-wheel low, and guns it out of there. He gets up the incline, but now he can see that all 5 guys are in the tree line of the meadow, and they are glaring at him. So he just continues to floor it all the way off that road, and just in time to see the sun deep below the horizon. The drive home, thankfully, was uneventful after that, but he's never returned to that area ever since.